Good morning. Tuesday, April the 7th, 2021. We continue our series navigating the landmines of a breakup, helping the single refocus their attention and affections. And this morning, I want to talk about how to respond to God, how a single should respond to what God is doing. And there's a premise that needs to be accepted here, and the premise is this: that God is sovereign, and all of his dealings with his creation are a balance of mercy and love, justice and holiness. God cannot compromise one attribute for another. So if he is sovereign, or since God is sovereign, and he is in complete control of things that are happening in a single person's life, then we need to learn how to respond to what he's doing. A poor illustration would be an employee learning how to respond to an employer who changes a procedure or adds another dynamic to a process, and the employee thinks that this is not really necessary, it's going to consume more time. Is it really going to make the production quicker? Is it really going to add value to the product? These are human questions for a human person who is finite. Such questions are insulting to God because he is infinite and his wisdom is always for our benefit. The glory that he gets is seeing his children walk in truth and love and peace and joy. So, what are some ways to respond to God, or how should a single respond? And this will be at least a two-part mini-series again within the series. So let me give you some introductory comments first. Knowing and accepting his will for your life right now is the Rock of Gibraltar, if you please. It's Mount Everest. It's huge. But the question that is raised is this: but what is God's will? God's will for you right now is whatever you do, whether you eat or drink, do all for the glory of God. God's will is for you to glorify him in everything. What is God's will? For you to obey him, to do what you know to be right and just and holy before him right now. James says that to him who knows to do good and does not do it, to him it is sin. What is God's will? For you to prove you are his disciples by bearing much fruit. John 15:8. What is God's will? For you to bring forth the fruit of the Spirit. Galatians 5:22 and 23. What is God's will? For you to exercise wisdom from above, not below. James chapter 4. What is God's will? For you to redeem the time, for the days are evil. Ephesians chapter 5. What is God's will? And this is the will of God, even your sanctification, that you abstain from sexual immorality. What is God's will? That you visit the widows and the orphans in their distress. You control your tongue, and you remain unstained by the world. James chapter 1. Frequently in relationships, biblical injunctions like the ones just cited to you fall by the wayside because the relationship turns inward and exclusive and not outward, upward, and inclusive. Sometimes God must interrupt a relationship because it is becoming a parasitic relationship. The God of sovereignty and human relationships is excluded. So God rearranges the relationship to make it perfectly clear whom must be first and foremost. Similar to how God tested Abraham to see if Abraham still loved God more than the gift of Isaac. How should I respond to this breakup? Well, go back, refamiliarize yourself with the will of God, and resume performing it right now. Loving God instead of being angry with God is one way to respond. Do you believe that God loves you? Do you believe his love for you is pure? Do you believe that God's love for you is without malice, hatred, or harm? Do you believe that God's every thoughts and intentions of his heart are focused upon you for your best? Then rein in your feelings of anger and choose to believe God is loving you through this breakup. The only ulterior motive God has, which motivates his every action, is your holiness before him. His love for you wants to protect you from being contaminated by the world. Often a father's love is viewed as harmful and cruel and uncaring. Children view their parents' no's as restrictive and insensitive. But over time, the child grows to be a teen and then an adult, and he or she now understand that the no's issued were out of love and for their welfare. It was not always easy to accept or welcome, but it was for his or her good. Trusting God rather than fighting God is a way to respond to what God is doing. We fight when we don't get what we think we deserve. I remember vividly fighting with God. I was in a relationship and was disintegrating quickly. We were engaged to be married. Many did not approve of the union, but we were pressing forward. Then it ended. We went to work that morning. I stayed in the apartment to pack and leave for out of state. I clearly remember arguing, crying, pleading, fighting with God to restore this sinful union. He did not, and I am so thankful he didn't. I was not trusting God. Once I began to trust God, to walk in his ways, and to acknowledge him in everything, he gave me what I truly needed. Her name is Carolyn, my bride of 45 years, now in glory, a faithful and honest companion. When you start trusting God, an overwhelming sense of his peace floods your soul, and one day you will be surprised by joy, as C.S. Lewis writes. When we get together tomorrow, we're going to talk about some questions a single should try to answer to refocus their attention and affection on God. I trust that you'll join